Imagine discovering that one of the most advanced civilizations in human history existed in Africa centuries before Europeans arrived. And then imagine that almost everything you were taught about it was either incomplete or deliberately distorted. A kingdom so wealthy that its capital city had streets wider than those in London, so advanced that it had street lighting in the 1500s, so organized that European visitors called it a miracle. And then imagine that this entire civilization was systematically destroyed, its treasures stolen, and its story buried for over a century. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're uncovering the truth about the Benin Kingdom, and I'm not talking about the modern country of Benin. I'm talking about the ancient kingdom that existed in what is now southern Nigeria, a civilization that was thriving when Europe was still struggling through the Middle Ages. By the time we're done, you'll understand why this story was hidden, what made this kingdom so extraordinary, and what the destruction of Benin tells us about how history gets written by those in power. If you're ready to learn about one of Africa's greatest kingdoms and why its story matters today, hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear will change how you think about African history, colonialism, and the stories we're told about civilization itself. Let's begin. The Benin Kingdom wasn't some small tribal settlement. By the 15th century, it was a sophisticated empire covering what is now southern Nigeria and parts of neighboring regions. The capital, Benin City, was massive. We're talking about a city with walls and moats that formed the largest earthwork in the world, larger than the Great Wall of China in terms of total material moved. Think about that for a second. The Guinness Book of Records has confirmed this. The walls and moats of Benin City required more earth to be moved than the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Great Wall of China combined. But size isn't what made Benin special, it was the sophistication. When Portuguese explorers first arrived in Benin in the late 1400s, they were stunned. These weren't supposed to be people who could build cities. This wasn't supposed to exist. Yet there it was, a royal palace that covered an area larger than many European cities. Streets laid out in a grid pattern, straight and wide, lined with houses. And here's something that blows my mind. They had street lighting in the 1500s. They used large metal lamps fueled by palm oil to light the main streets at night. London didn't have street lighting until the 1800s. One Portuguese explorer wrote that the streets of Benin City were wider and better maintained than any street in Europe. Another described the royal palace as being so large it was like a city within a city. Dutch visitors in the 1600s compared Benin favorably to Amsterdam. These weren't primitive people living in mud huts. These were urban planners, engineers, artists, and administrators running a complex society. And the wealth, oh, the wealth. The Benin Kingdom controlled trade across a vast region. They had a monopoly on pepper and other spices that Europeans desperately wanted. They traded ivory, palm oil, textiles, and later enslaved people, though we need to talk about that carefully because the Benin Kingdom's relationship to the slave trade was complicated and often deliberately misrepresented. The kingdom was selective about trade and fiercely independent. They didn't bow to European powers, they negotiated as equals.
The king, called the Oba, wasn't just a ruler. He was considered semi-divine, the spiritual and political leader. And the court surrounding the Oba was incredibly organized. There was a complex hierarchy of chiefs, administrators, and guilds. Yes, guilds. Like medieval Europe had guilds of craftsmen, Benin had guilds of bronze casters, ivory carvers, weavers, and blacksmiths. These weren't random artisans. They were organized, trained, and their work was regulated by the state. And that brings us to the art, the Benin Bronzes. If you've ever seen images of intricate brass plaques depicting warriors, leopards, kings, or you've seen those iconic brass heads with elaborate coral bead crowns, you've seen Benin art. These weren't simple crafts, these were masterpieces. The level of detail, the casting technique, the artistic vision, it was extraordinary. European scholars who first saw these artifacts in the late 1800s couldn't believe Africans had made them. Seriously. They theorized that maybe the Portuguese had taught the Benin people how to cast bronze, or maybe there was some lost Mediterranean civilization that had traveled to Africa. They created elaborate theories to avoid the obvious truth. Africans had developed sophisticated metalworking independently. The Benin bronze casting technique wasn't chaos. This was organization. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. In the late 1800s, European powers were carving up Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 literally had European nations drawing lines on maps, claiming territories they'd never even visited. Britain wanted control of the region around Benin because of trade, particularly palm oil, which was used in making soap and as a machine lubricant during the Industrial Revolution. Benin Kingdom controlled that trade, and they weren't interested in giving it up. British officials wanted a treaty that would give Britain control over Benin's trade. The Oba, Ovan Ramwen, refused. He maintained that Benin was an independent kingdom and would negotiate on its own terms. The British didn't like that. In 1896, a British delegation decided to visit Benin City to force negotiations. There was one problem. They were told not to come. The Oba sent messages saying that this was a sacred time, a period of important ceremonies, and visitors couldn't be received. Come later. The British ignored this. What happened next is disputed. The British delegation was ambushed, and most of them were killed. Some accounts say it was Benin warriors acting on orders. Others say it was a rogue group of warriors acting against the Oba's wishes. We'll probably never know the full truth, but what we do know is that Britain used this incident as justification for what came next: revenge. In February 1897, Britain launched what they called the Benin Punitive Expedition. Punitive. That word tells you everything. This wasn't about justice or security. This was about punishment, about making an example. British forces invaded Benin City with overwhelming firepower. They had modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery. The Benin warriors fought with older weapons. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. British forces captured Benin City, and then they destroyed it. Systematically, deliberately. They set fire to the city. The royal palace, which had stood for centuries, was burned. The ancient structures, the historical buildings, the archives, everything was put to the torch. Benin City, one of the greatest cities in Africa, was reduced to ruins in a matter of days. But before they burned it, they looted it. The Benin Bronzes, thousands of them, were taken. Ivory carvings, royal regalia, historical artifacts, anything of value was seized. British officers took them as personal trophies. The British government auctioned many of them off to museums and private collectors to help pay for the expedition. Yes, they funded a military invasion by selling the stolen treasures of the kingdom they just destroyed. The Oba was captured and exiled. The kingdom was annexed into British colonial Nigeria, and for over a century, Benin City remained a shadow of what it had been. The bronzes ended up scattered across the world. The British Museum in London has hundreds. Museums in Germany, Austria, and the United States have significant collections. Private collectors have more. And for over a century, these institutions refused to return them. Now here's what they never told you about all of this. The narrative that was created after the destruction of Benin was that Britain had civilized a savage kingdom, that they'd stopped human sacrifice, which did exist in Benin, and brought order to chaos. The bronzes were displayed in European museums as curiosities, proof of European superiority in collecting and preserving these primitive artifacts. The sophistication of Benin City, the complex governance, the advanced urban planning, all of that was downplayed or ignored. Textbooks didn't teach about the wealth of Benin or the fact that it had street lighting before most European cities. They didn't mention that European traders had been doing business with Benin as equals for 3 centuries. They didn't talk about the deliberate destruction of an ancient civilization for commercial and political gain. They called it a punitive expedition, as if it were a justified police action, rather than what it actually was, the violent erasure of an independent African kingdom that refused to submit to colonial rule.
And the saddest part? For generations, people believed that narrative. Even today, many people have no idea that the Benin Kingdom existed, or they think it was just a minor chiefdom, not a major civilization. The story was buried, deliberately, because acknowledging the truth about Benin means acknowledging uncomfortable truths about colonialism, about what was destroyed in Africa, and about the origins of many treasures sitting in Western museums. But things are changing. In recent years, there's been a growing movement for the return of the Benin Bronzes. Nigeria has been demanding their return. Some institutions are finally listening. In 2021, Germany agreed to return hundreds of bronzes. France has returned some artifacts. The British Museum has been more resistant, but the pressure is building. The conversation has shifted from if they should be returned to when and how. And in Benin City itself, there's a project to build a new museum that will house the returned bronzes and tell the true story of the kingdom. The Edo Museum of West African Art is being designed by the acclaimed architect David Ajayi. It will be a world-class institution, not just a repository for artifacts, but a center for scholarship and cultural preservation. It's a reclaiming of history. So why does this story matter? Why am I spending 10 minutes talking about a kingdom that fell over a century ago? Because the Benin Kingdom story is a microcosm of how history gets written and rewritten, how powerful nations erase the achievements of those they conquer, how colonialism wasn't just about taking land and resources, it was about taking dignity, taking history, taking the ability of colonized people to even know their own past. For decades, people in the region that was once the Benin Kingdom grew up not knowing the full extent of what their ancestors had built. They were taught that civilization came with the British, that before colonialism there was nothing of value. That's not accidental. That's the erasure of history used as a tool of control. If you convince people they have no history worth knowing, you can control how they see themselves and their place in the world. But the truth is coming out. The Benin Kingdom was remarkable. It was a sophisticated, wealthy, organized civilization that thrived for centuries. It had advanced urban planning, complex governance, incredible art, and a cultural richness that rivaled anything in Europe at the time. And it was destroyed not because it was primitive or savage, but precisely because it was advanced and independent and refused to bow to colonial power. That's the story they never told you about the Benin Kingdom. Not a story of primitive tribespeople saved by colonialism, a story of a great civilization destroyed by colonialism. And that distinction matters. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you found this eye-opening, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Drop a comment and tell me, had you heard about the Benin Kingdom before? What part of this story surprised you most? I read every comment and I'm genuinely curious what people think. And if you want to dive deeper into African history, I've got more videos coming that will challenge everything you thought you knew. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one.